time to wake up. It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up.
We already said we want to talk about transitioning away from fossil fuels today. As the gavel struck on the 13th December of last year, as it marked the end words of the COP28, right? All nations finally agreed to a just, orderly, and equitable transition away from fossil fuels. This is the wording that we want to talk about today, and we really want to talk about how important this sentence is, because there has been criticism if that was a really huge concession to the oil industry, maybe. So I'm really curious to find out your opinions about this. So let's talk about how we can make this just and equitable transition that is fast enough to save our planet, but at the same time doesn't leave anybody behind. But before we're going to discuss this question, I would like to ask you, Anders and Fatou, to introduce yourself real quick to our audience, because they haven't known you before.
Thank you so much. Really interesting presentation, Sandrine. I mean, you've shared really amazing facts and figures, and obviously, most importantly, that we need to redesign our system so that financing is actually distributed equally, because we are experiencing the disproportionate impacts of climate change around the world. So my name is Fatou Jeng. I am from the Gambia, founder of Clean Earth Gambia, and also one of the youth climate advisors to the United Nations Secretary General. So it's an honor to be here this morning sharing this panel with my co-panelists.
Yes, good morning. My name is Anders Levermann. I'm a physics professor at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. I've been contributing to the IPCC reports since 2004 and have been doing some economic work for the last 10 years, but mainly focused on weather extremes and tipping points in the past, and now the economic impacts of climate change. You might have recently seen our study on the economic commitment of climate change, showing what Sandrine, you alluded to a minute before, that we showed that in the next 20 years, the economic cost of climate change will be 6 times larger than the economic impact that a transition to renewable energies would have. And I think that's the framework we have to operate under.
Okay, let's dive in. Yeah, please give it up for Anders as well. Thank you. Okay, let's dive in. So we're throwing this term just and equitable around, okay? But let's nail down, like, what does it actually mean? What could be an equitable transition, and more importantly, equitable for whom? Is it the global south? Is it just the global north? Who are we talking about? Maybe, Fatou, you want to start with that?
Yeah, thank you so much. You've mentioned it in your introduction that obviously we've been seeing an increase in fossil fuel presence around the world, especially in the climate space. But for me, what equitable and just transition actually means for me is that we are acknowledging that we need equity and justice, centering marginalized and the most vulnerable communities impacted by the climate crisis. We must acknowledge how climate change is affecting these communities and making sure that we are bringing in solutions that are tailored to the needs of these people, the communities that are affected by climate change. So for me, this is what an equitable and just transition means for me. However, it is important to share that at COP28, we saw an increased presence of fossil fuel lobbies. There were about 2,456 fossil fuel lobbies at COP28. This was an unprecedented amount. And this presence of fossil fuel lobbies was actually even way more than the presence of the 10 most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change, according to the Global Witness. So what is this showing us? Is it showing that the presence of fossil fuel lobbies in the climate space is going to bring in positive changes, or it is going to be there, or they are going to be there for their individual interests? So it is important for us to make sure that we are identifying and we are actually seeing this presence and actually ensuring that their presence in the climate space is bringing in significant changes and not for their own interests. To bring you back, actually I briefly shared that yesterday in my presentation, but around the world, we are seeing an increase in global sea level rise in many coastal zones and in many coastal communities around the world. And drought has actually increased over the years, affecting over 600 million people in Africa. So obviously, with the increase in drought, we are seeing significant increase in food insecurity. And Sandrine actually mentioned it in her presentation, that food security is very important in order for us to address not only the climate crisis, but also the poverty that we are seeing around the world. So for me, we need to make sure that we are prioritizing the interests and the needs and the aspirations of the most vulnerable, ensuring that we are centering human lives and the planet over fossil fuel interests and fossil fuel profit. Because again, Sandrine has shared that about 2.8 billion per day is spent. That's what
it's immoral.
That's what
it's
oil
immoral.
and gas companies are actually getting in profit per day. So we need to make sure that there is enough funding, there is enough support to the most vulnerable communities and the most vulnerable societies that are affected by climate change. So for me, you asked to whom when we say equitable transition. So for me, it is making sure that, first of all, we are already addressing the existential crisis that comes with the impacts of climate change, but also making sure that communities are also having access to not only clean energy, but also having as little as electricity supply, because in our part of the world, in Africa, there are over 600 million people without even access to electricity. So we need to make sure that the existential crisis that comes with the climate crisis is solved, while also making sure that as we transition to a cleaner and more renewable, as well as just society, we are making sure that these communities have access to electricity, as well as other sort of solutions that they need for them to be able to not only have food security, and also a sustainable and healthier planet, but also having access to economic activities that will help them in sustaining themselves.
Mm-hmm. That's your applause. You mentioned the funding. I think that is a really important topic. Maybe you want to dive in, or you want to dive into that, because I think that's also a huge part of criticism, how we're doing climate financing so far, or how we've done it in the last years. How can we achieve an equitable approach here?
So first of all, we need to keep to our promises, right? I've been following the COPs for far too many years, so these are the climate negotiations. And the fact of the matter is that we promised, the largest high-income countries, to put funding into a pot of 100 million to give to the most vulnerable countries to at least be able to have some fiscal space to start to invest in the just transition. This has not happened, and that's a scandal. So that's point number one. Point number two, we have to go back to the systems, and that's why I brought in the broader economic system. First of all, most of the low and mid-income countries are strangled by debt. Debt that has been created in many cases through trade deficits and loans that were given while we were reaping the benefits as colonial economies, taking their materials for our own development. What we've been calling for, and also just released a letter actually recently during the World Bank and IMF meetings, was to say from 40 economists from Africa, get rid of the debt, cancel the debt. We need to realize that big investors and asset owners like BlackRock owns 50% of the African debt. It's a scandal. And they are not going to cancel that debt because they're making money off the debt. Yeah. So that's point number two. Point number three, we need to be careful that the language that you read, which is language from the final agreement at COP28 at the UAE, which was transformed from phase out fossil fuels to transition from fossil fuels, that we do not become duped by this so-called socially equitable language into not doing what actually will create the real just transition, which is phase out fossil fuels, phase out subsidies, transform that money into a fund to then enable a proper, just transition. And point number 3, we need special drawing rights which are allocated predominantly for the moment, which is actually finance that's allocated, additional finance, should have been allocated to low-income countries. Most of it has been allocated to mid- and high-income countries. That's a scandal, and we've called for those special drawing rights to go to where they belong, which is to the low-income countries.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a fund that should be set up. How do you view the loss and damage fund that has been set up? Is 700 billion enough?
So, again, 2.8 billion per day for oil and gas companies, 700 for the loss and damage fund. It was a start, but it's nowhere near where it needs to be. We need to put that perspective out there, and we need to really start talking real money.
Anders, now what's the science perspective on all of this? Do we even have time for a just and equitable transition, or do we just have to act like right now? Are we running out of time?
Yes, perhaps it's good to set the frame a little bit. And we have passed the 1.5 degrees last year. That doesn't mean that we have passed it permanently, but there was 1.5 degrees of global warming last year, which means on land it'll be 3 degrees. In Europe, but everywhere around the planet, the land is moving much faster than the rest of the planet. We know from very basic climate science that the amount of water vapor that you can keep in the atmosphere actually increases with the amount with the heating. So, and that's exponential, which means that the flood risk increases exponentially with global warming. And we recently published a paper where you can see very clearly that the climate models are actually underestimating the impact. With every degree of warming on land, which is 3 already now, 7% increase in the intensity of flood events will come, and 17% of the frequency, which means that we have already seen a 60% increase in floods. Having said all that, means that we have to go to zero carbon emissions as quickly as possible, and that is something which is different from other environmental problems. It's not enough to reduce things. The limit in the climate crisis is actually zero, and that is zero emissions from oil, gas and coal, and that's what we mean when we say phasing out fossil fuels. But this phasing out of fossil fuels is actually a great equalizer in the sense that we don't have to fight for the right to burn more oil or gas still until we are at zero. We have to go to zero as quickly as possible, all of us. Now, I think what's very important is that we don't generate a contradiction between justice and climate protection. That is very important. It's the same thing as we know. We can only reach one with the other and the other way around. So renewable energies can be used in Africa, can be used in parts of the world where there is no energy access at the moment. Electricity will be the fundamental form of energy that we use, and you can cool with it as much as you can heat the world with it. When I was young, heating with electricity was the worst thing you could do, right? It's not anymore. We have enough renewable energy on the planet. The only stuff that actually enters our world newly is energy every day in abundance. And we need to use this in order to fight entropy, to recycle whatever we need to produce, and to have enough energy to make life just for everyone on the planet.
Can I build on
Yes, please,
that?
of course.
Yeah.
Please all go in whenever.
Anders is absolutely right. And I used to be the chief partnership officer for a UN agency called Sustainable Energy for All, which talked about the access issues, in particular in Africa. There are so many micro solutions in Africa at the community level where we can bring in renewables. The biggest issue we have is the testosterone issue. I'm going to say this because it's really clear. Why have we not embraced energy efficiency? Why have we not embraced micro solutions? Because leaders have a tendency to want to have big and beautiful, and it is a testosterone issue. They want to cut this big ribbon in front of a coal plant, in front of, a big new oil plant. The fact is that most of our solutions are there, they're cheaper now, and they are community solutions, and that's not sexy. And so somehow our leaders, most of them being men, apologies, are making these testosterone decisions because they want big and beautiful rather than what actually works on the ground. And that is the greatest disaster that we have. And I think it's so important what Andrew says. We have to remember that renewables are now at parity in terms of price. It is the cheapest solution in many cases. There is no reason why we cannot start to phase out. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't think about a proper plan. We need to put in place the right infrastructure to make it happen so that people truly do have access and it's not a disaster.
Fatou, I'm curious what you're writing down here, if you have some. But I mean, we're talking about the countries in the global south, for example, now, and how we can achieve energy equitable for them. Coming from Gambia, what is something that you want the countries from like developing nations to know when it comes to this?
Thank you so much. I mean, this is really a very interesting and insightful conversation. I mean, Sandrine, I absolutely agree with you in terms of some of the decisions that have been made by our leaders in terms of the solutions in tackling the problems that we are facing. As you've mentioned, there are already micro solutions on the ground. There are already innovative solutions that are actually on the ground, led by young people, led by communities that are having significant impact. If we were here yesterday at the award night, I mean, one of my colleagues here, Ghislaine, who has an organization that is supporting communities in recycling, among others. And this is the same for many organizations that are actually underground. Yet what happens is when projects come in, it is not tailored to the local needs of people. That is why it is important when we come up with solutions, especially from the developed countries, coming in to support or work with developing countries, we need to make sure that the solutions that we have are actually tailored to the local needs of people. Because I have witnessed firsthand the past years, a project was actually implemented by one of the development partners in the Gambia for one of the local communities, and it actually failed. The community did not use that particular project. It was sort of some kind of a toilet but then they did not use it because when they were coming in to design or to implement this project, they did not consult these people to ask them what exactly they need and how they need this to be done. So if there is no community inclusion, then it becomes a problem in how well the projects that we implement is a success. So that is why it is really important to make sure that when we're designing policies, it is inclusive and we're making sure that the traditional and the local knowledge of people is actually effectively incorporated. Because indigenous people and people in the local communities for the past years have been managing lands and have been doing amazingly well in that regard, and they have been also doing other climate solutions in building their resilience. So that is very key. And the second thing, actually, in regards to the question, what I need to, or what I want businesses and leaders to actually do in terms of some of the solutions for our communities. Obviously, the first thing, the second thing after making sure that we are utilizing the local and traditional knowledge is most importantly the funding. I mean, we cannot talk about climate justice, we cannot talk about addressing the climate problems without obviously funding. Funding is key because there are certain projects that we need in our communities to build our resilience, but there is no funding available or there isn't sufficient funding. Sandrine has touched about the issue of the debts that we continue to build. We need to do away with the debts. We need to make sure that when we are bringing in funding, it doesn't come with strings, limiting governments, limiting the communities. We need to make sure that when we are actually making sure that we are implementing the lost and damaged fund, it is there to make sure that we are addressing the local needs of the people and not bringing in certain conditions that actually makes it really difficult for communities to actually benefit from this funding. So funding is key. And obviously, the current commitment from our world leaders in our climate negotiations for loss and damage and adaptation, especially for Africa, is quite low. That amount cannot solve anything. No. So we need to increase the funding that we have to ensure that we are making sure that we are addressing the climate problems. And obviously, and most importantly, when we are addressing the climate challenges and the problems, and especially while we are phasing out, not transitioning, but phasing out of fossil fuel, we make sure that we understand the different realities of the climate crisis of different communities. Because when you understand the different challenges that the climate crisis comes with for different communities, different continents, and different countries, then it makes it really easy for us to make sure that we are bringing in solutions that will not only include them in the implementation process, but also making sure that it is the best for them. Because sometimes when we generalize solutions, it doesn't work for everyone. So making sure that the solutions are localized is quite key in phasing out completely of fossil fuel.
And perhaps I can add here something from the physics point of view again. The renewable energies, and since we are at a GREENTECH festival here, the renewable energies have a much higher flexibility in some circumstances because, for example, in a world where in the global south where climate variability is, or weather variability is smaller than in the mid-latitudes, right, in the global north, you might want to have different solutions. For the local solutions that we talked about are perfectly fit for small countries, for small regions, for communities, while, for example, for the United States, for for Europe, for China, you would need large-scale solutions because the variability is different, which means, and that's what a lot of people always say, renewable energies aren't steady, right? Well, they are if you make the system, your energy system, big enough so that you accommodate a high-pressure system and a low-pressure system at the same time. It's very simple, and they have a physically bounded, a physically constrained size, which is basically the size of Germany, right? Or France, or whatever country you want to have. So if you have a European solution, if you have a Northern American solution, if you have a Chinese solution, you're fine, right? You need a grid that's doing that with some storage in between, and that's it. We have solutions we have big solutions, we have small solutions, it's all there.
I wanted to build on that because I really see the energy transition and the food transition as a way for us to start to work with the African continent. And I see it as a way for Europe and Africa to develop together in a very different way. I wish our leadership would understand what an opportunity this is. And it's an opportunity across the political space. Why? We will continue to have climate migration. By the way, we are all potential refugees, every single one of us. I'm in Belgium. Never did I think that we would have the floods that we had a couple years ago, like you had here in Germany.
Same in Germany, yeah.
So let us stop thinking that we're just helping or saving poor, starving Ethiopians. We're also saving ourselves together as a humanity, collectively. And that's important. That's important, that we realize that we're all in this together. We need to do things differently. And part of that is realizing that actually we can create a larger energy market across, for example, North Africa and Europe, working together and building up that infrastructure, that we can invest differently in Africa because it is becoming one of the most creative young populations that we've ever seen, whereas the Europeans are getting older. There is a way for us to understand how we can work together in terms of regenerative agriculture. We have a thriving agriculture production across African countries, and we need to work together to ensure that that continues by using new technologies like satellite technology, ensuring that we're enabling farming communities to localize but then produce also for Europe. There are so many ways in which we can engage in a much more holistic and whole relationship with our African continent.
Do you think that the governments in Europe that right now, they don't see this opportunity because you said you wished they would?
I think, and I'm an advisor to many of our politicians, including at the European Commission level, I think they're all a bunch of deer in the headlights. I think they've allowed for the fear-mongering that's coming from the radical right to freeze them rather than to enable them to become real leaders. I'm very scared that we are in a 1930s moment I come from grandparents who fought the resistance, from a grandfather that was in a concentration camp and another grandfather that was one of the first civil servants in the European Commission. And we are looking blindly at shifting towards an undemocratic system for Europe. And if we believe in democracy, working together is the only way forward. Brave leadership is the only way forward. And the European Green and Social Deal is the only way that we will actually be stronger and compete with China and the United States.
Yeah, I think you can give a hand up for that. Maybe one last question for all of you. Looking into COP29 coming up, what would give you hope that equity and transition are being taken seriously? Anders, maybe?
Yes, I'm a simple-minded physicist. It's the best solution, and that's why this is the one that will prevail. That's the hope part. It sounds naive, but that's the hope part.
You too, what do you say?
For me, what I look forward to for COP29 is, first of all, we need to be serious with the climate financing. We need to make sure there are stronger commitments, there are more seriousness from our leaders in committing to climate financing. Obviously, the second thing is loss and damage. We continue to see climate impacts around the world, yet when it comes to the compensation of the impacts of climate change, it is still a challenge. So we also need to make sure we are prioritizing loss and damage, especially the loss and damage fund. And the third thing I'd like to see is to make sure that when we are making our policies for COP29, it is more inclusive. We are getting the voices of indigenous communities, of young people, of civil society, of women and girls. These are the most vulnerable groups when the climate impacts occur. So we make sure that our policies is as inclusive as possible, and when we are bringing in solutions, we make sure that we are centering the needs of these groups that are mostly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And obviously, in general, we need to make sure there are just stronger commitments in making sure that we are reducing our global greenhouse gas emission. We are well beyond 1.5 degree commitment. We are the target, so countries are just shifting, and it's getting warmer, it's getting hotter, there are more flash floods, there are more climate displacements, there are more climate migrations, climate wars and conflicts, among others. So we need to make sure there are more commitments to make sure that we are addressing the climate crisis. And most importantly, capacity building, knowledge transfer, and obviously more technical support, collaboration and partnership, because this is the way forward. Collaboration, partnership between the different countries, making sure that we are prioritizing the most important, our needs in addressing the climate problems. So I am looking forward to some of these things for COP29.
Thank you, Fatou. Sandrine, one last sentence.
COP29 will be about damage control. It will not bring us any ambition. I was just with the Azerbaijan government. I'm so disappointed. I do not think that we should expect much, but we should ensure that there's not more damage than what already has been done. COP30 in Brazil will be about ambition. In the meantime, with Potsdam Institute, we have signed a COP reform letter where we have said we need totally different negotiations. But I think we need to be very clear. We need to hold the Azerbaijan government, but not just them, because they're just hosting, our governments accountable for ensuring that we at least bring the 100 million, make that happen, at least ensure that the loss and damage funds that we've committed to are disbursed, as well on forestry, as well as to indigenous people, and all the commitments that we have actually come to fruition. Most of them have not, and that's a disaster because, as Anders said, we are at 1.5 people. 20% loss in GDP. This is not just about climate as if it was separate from our lives. It's about economic damage and impacts on every single one of us. Until our governments wake up and realize that this is the greatest existential threat to society and to humanity, we're not going to make progress. We need to call on them to wake up.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, you guys.
It's time to wake up.